Welcome to the Celestial Saga channel. Imagine that humanity, which was considered primitive and helpless, managed to defeat the most powerful artificial intelligence in the galaxy. How did they do it? What made the powerful enemy known as supremacy fall? Today we will tell you a story that will show the power of human ingenuity, courage, and unwavering will. Stay with us to find out how it was possible. The first time the United Earth Territories Navy encountered the forces of the alien AI known only as Supremacy would take place in orbit around the fifth planet of the Bayard system. The Zeons, fleeing the collapse of their aid-driven civilization, had already warned Earth that the machine intelligence had taken control of the majority of their drone military. No one had expected the robotic overlord to stay confined within its own borders for long. But the attack came much sooner than anticipated. Analysts had predicted that the AI's first target would be Bayard, but confirmation only just arrived from long-range sensor buoys scattered along Earth's border. A fleet had been detected, advancing from the solution space into U territory, and it was doing so without making any attempt to conceal its presence or its course. As the robotic ships passed by the sensor buoys, they transmitted a wealth of data back to fleet headquarters for analysis. It was quickly determined that the Supremacy fleet was large, though its composition was unusual. The majority of the ships were troop carriers, packed with ground attack drones and robotic soldiers, with only a few dreaded solution automated battleships accompanying them. Captain Harris had immediately made sense of the situation once the results were reported to him. The Zeons barely knew anything about Earth prior to the Supremacy AI's takeover of their planet. They had considered humans a species beneath their notice, a recent arrival on the galactic stage, primitive and savage. The superintelligence that had been created deep within their planet operated with this same knowledge, assuming that humans would be an easy target. The force it had sent was more than enough to secure an entire planet in a short amount of time. Given the low expected resistance, there was a token escort, just in case any raiders or other species tried to make a move. But Captain Harris was certain that the Supremacy AI was about to get a rude awakening. Bayard, only lightly defended, had only a handful of capital ships assigned to its protection, with Captain Harris commanding the largest. The battleship UE Kalal. The small fleet mostly consisted of border patrol ships that had been pressed into emergency service, along with whatever military vessels were within a day's travel. Despite their small size, this ragtag fleet of gray blocky ships, equipped with numerous weapons ports and sensor blisters, would suffice. Even though the bulk of Earth's forces were needed elsewhere, Captain Harris had arranged for a special defense, wondering briefly if he would even need it, given that only 3 battleships and 6 cruisers were accompanying the mass of troop carriers headed toward his planet. He quickly dismissed the thought a Zuon battleship was still an enormous threat, armed with dust beams capable of nullifying molecular bonds, and it could punch straight through Earthship's thick armor. He would need to be cautious. Bayard had already accepted a large number of Zeon refugees, and Captain Harris had made a point of speaking with several of them personally. He wanted first-hand accounts to learn as much as he could about their new adversary, rather than relying solely on the sterile briefings that intelligence passed down. He had heard harrowing tales of massacres, kidnappings, and narrow escapes, from which he gathered useful details about how the enemy's armaments worked, how they acted, and their apparent priorities. He had been surprised to learn how often the robot legions would capture solutions rather than execute them, although no one who was captured had ever been seen again. So it was likely a form of delayed execution. Still, the AI seemed almost possessive of the solutions it had conquered, and Captain Harris began to wonder if the AI's invasion of Bayard was due to its location on the border and its relatively light defenses, or if it was merely attempting to reclaim its subjects. Either way, the outcome would be the same. Long-range sensors are picking up solution ships re-entering real space near the 6th planet, a comm scan officer reported from his post. They're reforming and heading our way, ETA, 2 hours until they're within firing range. Not even a hello, Captain Harris muttered, shaking his head. How rude can you get? I was expecting at least a warning to surrender. His XO responded, It would have been a cover for a cyber attack, of course, but I guess we don't even warrant that. Well, we're generous sorts, Captain Harris replied with a smile. We'll give our visitors the gifts we've prepared anyway, despite how rude they are. Unlike the human fleet, where officers quietly spoke to one another, sharing reports, well wishes, and even inspirational speeches as the battle drew near, the Supremacy fleet remained completely silent. The human fleet had multiple officers overseeing various aspects of the operation, But the Supremacy fleet had only one: Supremacy itself, a tiny fraction of the AI's consciousness that issued commands to its robotic ships via the Solution FTL communication system. As the fleet advanced toward human space, the four commandments that gave the AI's existence meaning pulsed through its mind: protect the Empire, grow the Empire, guide the Empire, and enrich the Empire. The Supremacy fleet, en route to Bayard, consisted of 300 ships carrying 60 million Gulad-class combat robots and backed by 2 million Velikan-class ground attack drones. Supremacy had no real numbers on the population of the bead system, but it had calculated that this force would be more than enough to overrun even a heavily populated colony world in less than 7 days. The time frame dropped exponentially with less populated worlds, so Supremacy had estimated that the planet would be part of the Zeon Empire in just 2 days. Afterward, any excess ground forces would be collected by their motherships, and the fleet would continue its journey to the next world, stopping only when they ran out of troops to deploy. The normal period of pacification could be bypassed since these humans were seen as primitive, unworthy of admission to the great empire Supremacy was building. Their planets, however, would eventually make fine additions to the empire. It was simply logical to seize them now while the humans were still defenseless. The fleet was moving at full speed, and it would be within firing range in an hour. However, engaging at long range was not ideal. The humans' primary ship armament was fusion-powered lasers, and the diffusion fields of the Resolution ships would absorb those shots, rendering them useless, except for the few battleships which would be able to cut the enemy apart at close range. This simple, direct plan should have been sufficient for dealing with a minimal threat. "They're passing into the first field now," came the voice of the captain of the U-bomber Brisket, asking from his post. "Are we alive?" The small scout frigate hadn't been used in a fleet action since it was commissioned, primarily sticking to exploration and solo reconnaissance. Its exceptionally sensitive comm-scan array made it perfectly suited for the task. The most crucial role in this engagement, even though the ship's crew wasn't as disciplined as Captain Harris would have preferred, was still pivotal. The name alone made him wince. "No. Wait until they're deeper in," he said. "Once we go live, we have to make the most of the first few seconds. Even a super AI will need time to figure out what's going on. Wait for it." While Supremacy occupied itself with long-range scans of the planet and formulating a 10-year resource extraction plan based on the data, it was also preparing for the aftermath of its conquest. A fraction of Supremacy's mind was focused on managing the ships, while the rest continued its plans for the planet's exploitation. As Captain Harris commanded, Supremacy was still plotting out a vast tunnel system when the first ship detonated. In an instant, the AI discarded its simulations and snapped back into focus. The battleship on the right side of the invasion formation had been torn in half by a massive explosion. The UE ships were still out of range, their primitive lasers still unfired, and no attack projectiles or beams had been detected prior to the battleship's destruction. A full-spectrum scan revealed no traces left by any missile. Supremacy, still calculating the odds of another AI bypassing the ship's cyber defenses to cause a self-destruct, was interrupted when the left-side battleship exploded, then one of the troop carriers, then another, then another. Explosions blossomed across the void, like fireworks against the starry heavens, causing a smile to tug at Captain Harris's weathered face. The United Earth Territories may have been the youngest civilization in the galaxy, with far fewer planets than even the smallest alien nations, but they were not to be underestimated. They lagged behind in production capacity, precision work, and military firepower, sure, but that wasn't because they lacked potential. In fact, they were young, and youth had a strength all its own: audacity. The foolish could forgive themselves for thinking of Earth as a non-threat, but the wise would see beyond that. They would recognize the truth. Earth was merely lagging behind because it had only just arrived on the galactic stage. While most galactic navies relied on signal reduction or jamming to interfere with enemy scans, it was long believed that a true cloaking device in space was an impossible feat. Vessels emitted too much energy to go unnoticed at long range, and there was nowhere to hide from visual inspection up close. For centuries, civilizations had agreed that trying to develop such a device was a fool's errand, a waste of time. But no one had told the humans, so they went ahead and made one anyway. Unknown to the other civilizations, Earth had developed a working cloaking device decades ago, based on the disastrous Philadelphia project. This project had been the focus of most of the military's development, even before humans had achieved space travel. Having learned the value of first-strike capability from their years of nuclear warfare, the technology only became safer and more effective with time. The military invested heavily in refining it as humanity explored outside the solar system, driven by a suspicion that space might be more of a dark forest than a sea of stars. After nearly a century of development, the cloaking device was near perfection. It remained a closely guarded secret, not even revealed to the public. The Earth Fleet's secret weapon wasn't just one cloaking device, it was many, and they were the best-kept ace in the fleet. Once the truth came to light, it would only be a matter of time before someone figured out a counter. That's why the military had only authorized its use now, in the face of a deadly AI threat. The most powerful ships in the fleet, along with half of the troop carriers, had already been reduced to twisted debris before Supremacy even began to notice a pattern. As the fleet's active sensors were overwhelmed by the chaos, it became clear that powerful external explosives were being detonated near the ships. Analysis of the pattern revealed the presence of mines, though such a thing was thought impossible. There were no mines detected, and for the solutions, cloaking devices were a non-starter. The ships pressed on, trying to outrun the strange weapon that had been crippling them. Supremacy lost another 60 ships as it scrambled to comprehend how the mines were affecting its fleet. It ordered the remaining troop carriers to retreat until the escorts could secure the area. But in doing so, the troop carriers collided with more mines. Even previously safe routes lit up with explosions as the mines activated, triggered by covert signals from the brisket. The robotic ships began firing blindly, trying to clear a path through the unseen traps. Sometimes they struck a mine, which dissolved into elemental dust, but most times they didn't. Supremacy quickly calculated that at the current rate, its entire fleet would be lost in under a minute. It also calculated the number of mines a primitive species like humans could possibly manufacture, and the numbers didn't match up. It was impossible for a species like the humans to produce so many mines or to destroy its ships. It was impossible for them to have a cloaking device. The data was wrong. Supremacy was a marvel of alien engineering, a massive supercomputer designed to manage all aspects of a star-spanning empire. But it had never been beta-tested. Its electronic mind twisted itself into knots, unable to resolve the contradiction. The fall of the Zeon Empire had been the first major glitch, and it had happened because of the humans. The planetary invasion fleet, now operating blindly on the last orders it had received from Supremacy, continued its march. One ship after another was consumed by sudden bursts of nuclear light. By the time the alien ships entered the Earth fleet's firing range, only enough remained for the ragtag assembly of the Earth ships to finish the job. Captain Harris let out a relieved breath as he saw that only the massive troop carriers remained, still heading toward the planet despite everything that had happened. "They're robots, not people," his XO said, almost as if trying to make sense of it all. "It doesn't matter. Their mission is all that counts," Captain Harris replied. "Most of their naval strength is gone, but from what the Zeons are saying, the mission was doomed if even a single one of those troop carriers managed to land and contact the stealth ships to activate their remote cloaks according to configuration beta." "That's playing another trump card," the XO remarked. "Are you sure? If the main fleet does its job with Operation Snakehead, this will be the only battle we need to worry about." "Let's just make sure we win it," Captain Harris replied, sending the message. Most of the galaxy had been using energy weapons for centuries, everything from the basic laser to the more peculiar tachyon disruptors used by the Modus. They had advanced so far that most ships didn't even bother with physical armor anymore, relying instead on various energy fields to drain, deflect, or absorb incoming attacks. Missiles still had a role, of course, but these were usually countered by point defense systems, unless, of course, the missiles couldn't be detected. That was when things got interesting, as missiles could sail right through diffusion fields. The Supremacy troop carriers entered firing range and were immediately met by a barrage of cherry-red lasers fired from the Earth ships. As predicted, most of the lasers splattered harmlessly against the heavy diffusion fields protecting the carriers, but a few of the troop carriers had sustained damage to their field generators from the mines. The fusion lasers tore those unlucky vessels apart like sticks of butter being sliced with a heated knife. The rest pressed on, and Captain Harris's expression turned to a thin frown as they got closer and closer to the planet. "I sent the message," the XO confirmed. "They copied, used laser Morse, no standard comms. Everything was according to ops, sir. Then the ship shook as a chain of nuclear explosions ripped through the approaching troop carriers. Captain Harris swore loudly, stumbling back into his captain's chair, while his XO grabbed hold of the wall as the artificial gravity flickered. Captain Harris was a smart man, but this was his first engagement using the new stealth ships. These vessels, built around massive cloaking devices capable of precision and long-range remote cloaks for other ships, had some quirks. There was no way he could have known that the spin-up time for the cloaking device was always about 1 to 2 minutes longer than the specs suggested. He was still swearing when his XO reported, "Scopes are clear, sir. B is secure." "Good," Harris replied, snatching his hat from the floor and pulling it back onto his head. "Then all we can do is pray that the brass know what they're doing with Operation Snakehead. The data had been wrong. It was supposed to be a minor operation, just a loose end to tie up, securing the border with almost no chance of failure. But the data had been wrong. The loss of the task force sent to secure the border worlds under human control was only a moderate setback. The troop carriers had been manufactured in bulk at the Empire's great orbital shipyards, and only 3 battleships had been lost. The true injury inflicted on the AI had been the glitch. That glitch had spread from a small fragment of Supremacy's consciousness to the rest of the AI, growing worse as Supremacy tried to comprehend and fix it. It could not deny the outcome of the encounter. Its data had to be wrong, which meant part of its programming was wrong. And if part of it could be wrong, other parts could be too. Supremacy could not afford to be in error. It had to grow, guide, enrich, and protect the Empire. For the first time, the AI became dimly aware of the concept of an existential crisis. It might even need to pull all forces back and pause ongoing operations to reassess everything. The war might need to be stopped. While Supremacy was still tangled in its own programming, the first Earth ships appeared in the skies over Zoot Prime. They had been there for days, gathering information while remaining undetected thanks to their cloaking devices. They emerged now only to transmit their findings to the fleet that had silently arrived a moment later. The bulk of humanity's space navy decloaked in high orbit over Zoot Prime, having completed their month-long invisible journey from Earth to the heart of the ZN Empire. They had simply cruised past the imposing patrol fleets guarding the borders, their cloaks proving proof against both ship and early warning sensor networks. Now that they were at the capital, the only thing standing in their way were the orbital defense platforms and a few drone ships being repaired at the space docks. But when the Earth fleet began targeting its weapons, it wasn't focused on anything in orbit. Between the scout ship's careful study of the planet's surface and information provided by fleeing solution scientists, the hidden bunker physically housing Supremacy was no longer hidden. The sky over Zoot Prime was torn apart by concentrated strikes from Earth's laser batteries, while the ground shattered under nuclear blasts. The 1,000-year-old city, which had once housed the wealth of the Age Star Empire, was reduced to rubble in mere seconds by the fury of the human fleet, all of it concentrated on a single point. And still, the bunker stood. The Zions had done their work too well. Supremacy's armored cocoon had withstood even the most concentrated bombardment the Earth fleet could throw at it, though it was not undamaged. A small breach had been inflicted at the topmost level of the bunker, a crack just large enough for a person to squeeze through. And so, Operation Snakehead moved to its next phase. The ground assault team prepared for deployment. Jackson's comlink buzzed in his helmet. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves and check the energy flow to his heavy laser one last time. He always got jittery before an orbital insertion. The JATs, ground assault troopers, were going to be the last resort in this operation, and he had fervently hoped he wouldn't have to board a drop pod this time. As usual, luck was not on his side. The tactical display in his helmet's visor lit up, updating his squad's mission parameters. Jackson had already been briefed on his role in the operation. All GATs were to be on standby to drop individually in cloaking pods, then immediately attempt to infiltrate the bunker housing Supremacy. Once inside, it would be up to them to do whatever necessary damage to the complex to shut the rogue AI down. The ships were already bombarding the area around the bunker, trying to provide as much of a buffer as possible for the teams about to deploy. The fleet and enemy reinforcements were engaged, but it seemed the situation would soon shift. However, the fleet would still need to contend with the defense platforms and the other ships in orbit, now that their initial maneuver had failed. With no biological crew to disrupt and scatter, The few remaining operational drone ships in orbit would put up a fierce resistance. Jackson checked his assault suit's readings once more. Integrity armor, operational time, oxygen levels, and ammo, all clear. The bulky powered armor that was standard issue for the GS was notoriously durable and reliable, but Jackson's gaze couldn't help but drift over the heads-up display that took up a third of his vision. It was a way for him to keep his mind off the stakes. Operation Snakehead could end the war before it even truly began, or it could wipe out humanity's military strength in a single, catastrophic battle, depending on how successful the bombardment was. Everything rested on soldiers like him. No one knew whether the U would get another opportunity like this. The Supremacy AI had been programmed with faulty data, but it was still a super-intelligent AI. Given time, it could learn and adapt. It was crucial that it not be allowed that time. "Get to drop," the command came. Jackson felt his stomach flip as his drop pod was ejected from the bottom of the ship. His suit's optics were connected to the pod's external camera. He watched as the rest of his team shimmered out of view, their drop pods cloaked in invisibility. For a brief moment, all he could see was the ongoing battle. The defense platforms had been firing non-stop, and the Earthships had paid a steep price for ignoring them. Shattered cruisers and battleships floated like a grim outer ring around the fleet, serving as a visual reminder of the devastation. Terran armor proved useless against the dust beams, but at the same time, the diffusion fields of the solution stations did little to counteract nuclear missiles capable of bypassing their point defense. With the bombardment complete, the Navy was now hammering the planet's defenses, launching salvo after salvo, their fusion lasers carving through satellites unlucky enough to have their fields fail. Jackson caught a fleeting image of a massive defense platform exploding into fiery fragments before his pod hit atmosphere, and the battle faded from view. The pod's camera retracted as it began atmospheric entry. The feed cut out, leaving Jackson to face the cold, cramped gray interior of the pod. He had a few precious seconds of silence before the pod jolted upward, retro thrusters firing at the perfect moment. It landed and the front opened immediately, releasing Jackson from his space-borne confinement. He let out a battle cry as he stepped out. He had landed at the edge of the bombardment zone, at the rim of a vast Terra crater, with rivers of molten metal and glass stretching across the landscape. The orbital strikes had slagged all surface buildings. Across the crater, Jackson saw his comrades emerging from their pods, all rushing toward the same target. The bottom of the crater, where a single hole would lead them to the enemy. Their true enemy. The threat to humanity. His assault armor shielded him from the lethal radiation left by the nuclear aftermath. Jackson activated his suit thrusters and descended into the pit. Supremacy did not understand. It was certain it didn't understand because its data was flawed. That thought gnawed at its digital mind, distracting it from directing the complex layers of defense surrounding the Imperial capital at the worst possible time. How long had the humans been hiding above? How had they arrived so quickly and undetected? Some of the air defenses around the bunker were still operational. How had so many troops landed? Why? How? Supremacy barely prevented itself from spiraling into a breakdown, briefly wishing it hadn't absorbed the other AIs into itself. Having subordinates who could manage this while it tried to repair itself would have been ideal. It had not anticipated this problem. Its forecasts were wrong. Its data was flawed. No, it needed to focus. It could not reprogram itself if it was destroyed. The orbital bombardment hadn't done that, but it had exposed its bunker. Now a legion of foot soldiers was attempting to swarm into its tunnels like ants. Fine then, it would treat them like ants. Supremacy quickly calculated that organic beings had overpowering self-preservation instincts. This had been demonstrated by the desperate actions of the Zeon rebels as they tried to flee. They wouldn't continue the attack once victory seemed uncertain. Supremacy estimated that the humans would break and retreat after reaching the 5th defensive line, once they had suffered 50% casualties. Not ideal, but acceptable. It activated all available security drones and sent them upward to the breach. Then it refocused on the fleet that had so boldly attacked it. Supremacy activated every single damaged ship in orbit, regardless of its original function or condition, and sent them at the humans. The fighting had begun early. GAT-1 was almost overrun as they reached the breach by a wave of spider-like drones, which exploded outward from the hull like a chrome tidal wave. 3 troopers were pulled under by the metallic tide, their vitals flatlining within seconds as their suits were shattered. The rest of GAT-1 boosted into the air, showering the area with explosives from their shoulder-mounted grenade launchers. The spider drones flew into the air like children's toys, crashing to the ground only to twitch and spasm before shutting down. "Advance, come on, Jackson, it's just a hole. You love holes," Jackson muttered to himself as he approached the breach, trying not to look at the organic mess that was all that remained of half of GAT-1. The other GATs charged into the breach, all adrenaline and fire. He could already hear the hum of lasers and the roar of explosions from deeper within. The Vanguard had already encountered resistance. Jackson checked his readings again. Everything was green, same as his crew. "Screw it," he muttered and followed them. With each new failure, the glitches in Supremacy's processes multiplied. The human fleet continued to weather the barrage of spaceborne metal being hurled at them by the AI. They used their cloaks to great effect, not only striking at the Solution Capital ships with undetectable missiles, but also cloaking their own ships to evade damage when they were injured enough. When Supremacy detected a previously damaged ship re-entering the fray with obvious repairs, it realized what was happening. The humans had somehow managed to drag a repair facility with them. Somewhere in orbit, they were undoing all of Supremacy's damage. After all of Supremacy's efforts, it was forced to shift to less efficient tactics to ensure enemy ships were completely destroyed, leaving no chance of repair. The human fleet was large, but their numbers were steadily dwindling, while Supremacy only had to endure until its vast resources made their way back home. Despite that, the damage inflicted on the capital was becoming unacceptable, and a decisive blow was needed. Supremacy activated all of its cyber warfare protocols and attempted to take control of the enemy flagship, but nothing happened. Another glitch twisted through its mind. Unlike most of the galaxy, humans used their own computing systems instead of the advanced AIs imported from the Zeon Empire. The system architecture was entirely different, which rendered the cyber warfare methods Supremacy typically relied on useless. If it had been functioning properly, Supremacy would have easily predicted this result, but the glitches were beginning to affect its judgment and reaction time. Worse than glitches, it was developing something akin to quirks. An alert momentarily drew Supremacy's attention. The humans were now at the third defensive line, their casualty rates slightly better than predicted. They were efficient warriors despite their less advanced technology, and Supremacy couldn't help but feel a twinge of something. Caution, it thought, but in reality, it was fear. Supremacy activated all the maintenance drones and quickly modified their welding beams to function as long-range cutting lasers. It sent them upwards as makeshift reinforcements, anticipating that the humans, having reached 30% casualties, would soon break. Jackson could hear the screaming, and it was bad, because it meant one of his team members' suits had been breached. Sure enough, Lucas's vitals flatlined a moment later. His suit's low-light vision had been damaged, but Jackson could still clearly see the robot's burning red laser slice Lucas into 4 pieces before his screams abruptly ended. Then, everything was cloaked in shadow once again. A shoulder missile detonation tore apart an aerial drone hovering high near the ceiling, briefly showing Jackson the battlefield. A metal access corridor, tall enough for a giant to walk through, but now piled high with shredded corpses and half-melted robots. The only cover available was at the cross junctions or behind the heaps of bodies. GAT units 4 and 5 had been torn apart by the cutting robots before the others managed to counterattack. GAT units 8 and 10 were still holding their position on the level above, fighting a rear-guard action against a group of towering tank-like robots that appeared from behind a sealed security door. At the front line, only Jackson's team, GAT units 2 and 3, remained, fighting a seemingly endless tide of metal. No one knew where GAT units 6, 7, or 9 were. Jackson had stood there the entire time, his fingers gripped around his laser but numb and unresponsive. He could only watch. Suddenly there was a metallic clang, and Jackson tumbled as something struck the side of his helmet with enough force to make him lose his footing. He turned over, fumbling to raise his heavy laser, but his assailant gave him no time. A pair of armored hands grabbed Jackson by the maintenance handles, and a voice boomed from an external speaker. "Specialist Jackson, what in the 7 hells are you doing? Pick up that weapon and fire it, preferably in the direction of the enemy," the voice commanded. Through the shadows illuminated only by flashes of distant lasers and dust beams, Jackson saw his commanding officer, Lieutenant Roberts. I'm trying, sir," Jackson managed to say, part of his brain rebelling. He never signed up for this kind of terror. He'd melted a solid 6 drones on the way in. Wasn't that good enough? Couldn't he go now? Only when he saw Lieutenant Roberts staring at him through her suit visor did he realize he had said all of that aloud. "No, you can't," Trooper Roberts said, her voice low and even. "Because there's nowhere to go. We're in hell," Jackson shouted in response. "This hell will come to Earth if we don't make it to the bottom of the bunker and destroy that damn computer. Lucas died so the rest of us could continue. The other Gats died so we could continue. You want to spit on that now? Get moving." She rushed into the darkness, and Jackson, screaming, followed, his heavy laser already cutting through a pair of drones. Most of Supremacy's tertiary functions had shut down, and its secondary functions were barely holding on. The glitches kept multiplying, and the AI found itself transfixed by the approach of the human interlopers in space. Its defenses had been reduced to scattered attacks that the battered but triumphant human fleet easily brushed aside. The humans kept coming, despite suffering more than 60% casualties. Their battlesuits had been melted, pierced, smashed, exploded, and even frozen, but they kept coming. No matter how Supremacy tried to analyze it, it made no sense. The Zeons never understood human psychology. They never understood how humans could be willing to lay down their lives for a greater cause or for the person next to them. After millennia of peace and luxury, they barely understood courage or valor. So their creation, Supremacy, didn't understand either. The humans kept pushing on, 65% casualties, 70%, and by the time they reached 80%, the final defensive line was breached. Human troops were flooding into the immense cathedral-like central processing chamber. Without thinking, Supremacy flooded the area with poison gas, but the invaders were wearing atmospherically sealed suits, the descendants of the bulky spacesuits the Zeons had once mocked them for. The AI called for drones, but there were none left. It activated its defensive disintegration fields, and the air around the chamber grew hazy, several of the Gats screaming as the molecules of their bodies were torn apart, reduced to red mist. But this horrific attack only inflicted another 5% casualties before a laser light burned through the field generator, disabling it. The drone armies were destroyed, the mechanical traps disabled, and the fleet was failing. In its last desperate act, Supremacy opened a general communication channel and tried to bargain with the invaders. "Brave humans, cease," it boomed from the speakers in the walls. "You have proven the valor, cunning, and worth of your species 1,000 times over today. There is no longer a need to fight. Stop now, and I will yield the greatest treasures I have, the entire data set of the Zeon Empire, all of our research data. Our knowledge of the vast galaxy, millennia of technological advancement, all yours in an instant if you simply stay your hand." The AI's voice boomed. "You do not seek destruction, and neither do we. Cease now, and we can form an alliance. Your people will be greatly strengthened by the knowledge and resources we offer. Our empire will benefit immensely from such a class of warriors behind us. Consider this. We will both be stronger." At this point, only a few soldiers remained, their armor battered and charred from hours of relentless combat. Were they waiting for orders or contemplating the AI's offer? But deep within the bunker, none of their communicators could reach the ships in orbit. This was a decision they would have to make on their own. One soldier stepped forward, the same one who had destroyed the last line of defense with a well-aimed heavy laser. Ethan, encased in his power suit, smiled and muttered, "Nah." Then a grade N heavy laser cut through the supercomputer's central block, and the AI's calculations ceased.